I don't know if you guys saw this, but Trump went on the PBD podcast. They have on a bunch of bright experts to talk about the war in Ukraine. Experts like Jimmy Dore. Yeah, that's about it. But no, they have had a bunch of colorful guests to talk about the war. It's not exactly the place I would go to if I wanted to have the most highbrow conversations about the war in Ukraine. But I hadn't seen much of something like this from an elected official on the show before. And this is the former president of the United States. Donald Trump went on the podcast and then 19 days out from the election decided to blame Zelensky for the war in Ukraine, saying that he should have stopped this at the start of it, before then moving on to blame Biden for provoking and instigating the war with Russia, with Putin. Listen to this.
I think Zelensky's one of the greatest salesmen I've ever seen. Every time he comes in, we give him $100 billion. Who else got that kind of money in history? There's never been. And that doesn't mean I don't want to help him, because I feel very badly for those people. But he should never have let that war start. That war's a loser. Ukraine, remember, is not Ukraine anymore. Every city almost is knocked down to the ground. All those beautiful golden domes are laying on their side, smashed to smithereens. There's no city. You go into the city and every building is demolished. It looks like a demolition crew went through. They've been hit by missiles. This should have been settled before it started. It would have been so easy. If we had a president with half a brain, it would have been easy to settle. And I'm not, everyone would say, oh, this is terrible. He's blaming Biden. Well, I do largely blame Biden. If you watch his words were the exact opposite of what he should have been saying. He instigated that war.
Okay, so I do want to say something about the end there. He said the words he said were the exact opposite of what he should have been saying. Well, Trump has still not only not put out there what exactly his 24-hour peace plan would be outside of I'll call him, and it'll be a fly time. We'll get all this settled because they all respect him. He hasn't proposed an alternative of how he would have handled the lead up into the war. And you want to know why? Because it's a very difficult position for any U.S. president to be in. The American people are not that interested in an on-the-ground intervention. An on-the-ground intervention against a nuclear power would be bad, but America's made a lot of security guarantees to Ukraine. United States and Ukraine and NATO have integrated themselves. Military experts were at the start of the war saying that they wouldn't last a week, but then when the Russians did invade, after we warned the public, they ended up lasting much longer, and a lot of the experts ended up being wrong. And I don't know if Trump would have been in there and he would have, gone to Kiev when Biden wouldn't kick a few of the tanks, looked around and said, yep, Ukraine's going to hold, as if he was going to have some knowledge Biden didn't, or do something that Biden didn't, do more, do less, say something different. He hasn't proposed it. So he's spitballing while offering no alternative. Because sometimes you only have a selection of bad options, then you choose one of the bad options, and someone from the sideline says, why didn't he just do the good thing? Let me give you an example. Like sometimes I'll be talking to people who don't have much of a connection to the war, and they'll see like a Ukrainian infantryman go on some assault and get killed, or there'll be some footage online and they'll be confused by it. And like some veterans from other wars, for example, Afghanistan or Iraq, and they'll say something along the lines of like, why don't they just airstrike that position? It's like, okay, well, if that was an option, I'm sure they would have, but they probably don't have the munitions, so they only have a bunch of bad options. Throw some grenades in there and hope for the best, try to crawl up whatever option you have available. And so it's really easy to spitball from the sidelines while offering no alternative. That isn't leadership, that's just YouTube commentary, which, Trump would probably be much better at, if I'm completely honest with you. Okay, so that's the one thing at the end there. As for the rest of this, let's start with the big one. The big one is obviously what he said here.
Every city almost is. That war's a loser. He should never have let that war start. That war's a loser.
Okay, so Zelensky should never have let that war start. when the war started, Zelensky was doing the voice acting for Paddington Bear 2, I believe, or one of the Paddington Bear movies back in like 2014, 2015. I don't know what you expected Paddington Bear to do about the Russian invasion back in 2014. It was going to go in there with, you know, I don't know, Winnie the Pooh and the rest of the gang, pick up whoever he could and stop the rush. But Zelensky was not in office in 2014, 2015. He was still an actor. It was only when he got elected in 2019, later, that he actually had hands on the realm, on the reins of power and could have some influence. And Zelensky ran, even though most people probably don't remember this because, Americans and people outside of Ukraine probably don't remember the 2016 domestic Ukrainian election cycle. But Zelensky ran on a peace platform. Zelensky ran on the idea of reconciliation with the Russians. Not on the idea that we're going to give the Russians this, and that, but the idea that solving the Donbass and Crimean crises through military force is not the way. Ukraine must be strong, but we must approach this from a diplomatic angle. Rich, thank you so much for the tier 1 sub. I appreciate that on YouTube. And so that's what Zelensky approaches, but there was no headway with Putin. Now, you can try to spitball from the sidelines as to exactly why that is. I would put forward that there's a high likelihood that Putin was not going to accept anything that would leave Ukraine as sovereign as it wanted to be, or with it getting its territory back and allowing its displaced people to return, especially since many of those homes were already being given out to Russian settlers. But Zelensky couldn't have done anything to stop the war back then. As for 2022, what could Zelensky have done differently? What could he have done differently? Could he have given up land? Is that what he would ask them to do? Was that what Trump would have done if America was in that position? Give up California if the Chinese were threatening us? Would he have given up their military and asked for Ukraine to demilitarize? Would Trump do that if America was in that position? Would Trump ask for the Ukrainians to demilitarize and give up all of their physical leverage? One of the few things that allowed them to still have parts of the Donbass when the Donbass war started, that allowed them to take back cities like Kramatorsk, which still are in Ukrainian hands, even though the Russian-backed separatists took it in 2014. It was the Ukrainian army that took it back. It was the Ukrainian army that was on the path to victory back in 2014, 2015, before the Russian military intervened directly while saying they weren't, because they just removed the patches from their uniform and moved the tanks across the border. So would he ask for the demilitarization? Is that what he would demand? Because that doesn't seem like something the art of the deal guy would do, undercut your leverage and then hope that your opponents don't take advantage of you for it later just based off their word. That wouldn't seem smart. That wouldn't seem smart at all. Would he give up the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, which again is, if you're going to trade something like that, you want something in return. For example, your land back, or for example, maybe some prisoners back, whatever it would be, you would want something in return. You would expect the art of the deal guy to propose some sort of deal that Zelensky should have taken, propose some alternative. If Zelensky could have made some grand proposal while the Russians were sending troops to the border, and the whole time, mind you, and this is the same problem with in 2014, the Russians are denying that they're going to invade in the first place, which does add a little complexity to the situation, doesn't it? So what could Zelensky have done to avoid the war? And even if there is things that he could have done, would those things be worth it? Would those things, if he gives up his military and he demilitarizes, does that just avoid the war for 3 years and next time the Russians take Kiev? And so all he did was make it so he's fighting a war now 3 years later, but with no armed forces? So when he says Zelensky should have done this, done why, I mean, you could say this to any country that gets it. Poland should have negotiated better with the Germans in 1939. The Russians were saying, and Putin specifically, the ruling class, the big man in charge, was saying that Ukraine could only exist as an extension of Russia, who's writing big essays in advance of the invasion about how Ukraine is a historical part of Russia, is part of the Ruski Mir, and not only Russia could this logic be applied to Russia, but other post-Soviet states as well, and therefore, if it does not act as an extension of Russian interests and Russian influence, then it does not have a right to exist at all. So he has an ideological underpinning for his invasion. He's putting his troops on the border while denying what he's going to do the whole time. And he's making demands that both Ukraine could not give up and demands of America of us withdrawing troops from Eastern Europe that would be completely against at least Eastern European interests of NATO, if the Eastern European NATO states to give up. And so would he be asking Zelensky to make us give those things up in concessions? All of this is speculation. He just basically poked Zelensky as he should have done something different at the start to avoid war, while placing little to really actually no blame in this conversation on Putin himself. And, you know, it's just, I mean, I don't know what I'm supposed to expect from Trump at this point, but Trump blames Zelensky for war when Zelensky is the president of the country that got invaded and then had territory annexed off of it after they already had Crimea annexed, after Donetsk and Luhansk had big chunks taken out of it, after Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal. Like, how much more should Ukraine have given up? How much more should they have given up? He doesn't clarify any of this because the details is where Trump starts to falter. Rachel Atwood, thank you for the $2. To save his life, could Trump explain Minsk 1 and Minsk 2? I would pay to see it. I would absolutely pay to see it. Here's another thing in here that I thought was strange. See, Trump has lied a few things about a few things around the war. One lie that he tells is about the death count, where he says millions upon millions have died, and they're lying about the numbers. I don't know anybody, and I know a fair amount of people who count casualty data. And when I say count casualty data, I mean the grueling, soul-crushing work of watching video after video after video of everything that's published and watching everybody die and then counting the bodies afterwards, and doing that similarly with vehicles. And I know people who do that. And then they compare it to the official numbers and try to find like what's similar, and like, you know, none of them would say millions upon millions have died. And the higher echelons, you might be able to combine all the soldiers on both sides plus all the civilians to get something that could get close to maybe 1 million if you're being unbelievably generous here. But he's just throwing out like randomly just like terrifying death data, I think mostly to scare the public who will not know about the data, who will not know the specifics. But another thing he says here is a new kind of, it's not the same thing, but it's meant to elicit the same effect. He does something new here that I haven't heard before. Or I don't know if it's new because I heard something similar, but this is maybe the first time I've mentioned it.
Ukraine, remember, is not Ukraine anymore. Every city almost is knocked down to the ground. Mm-hmm. All those beautiful golden domes are laying on their side, smashed to smithereens.
There are cities that have been smashed to smithereens, like Popasna, Volchansk, Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar is having that experience, Volchansk, Mariupol had that experience, even though the Russians have done some rebuilding, most of it with shoddy, corrupt contractors, but they have done some. But there's no calculation where the majority of Ukraine cities have been burnt down to, and the way he describes it.
There's no city. You go into the city and every building is demolished. It looks like a demolition crew went through. They've been hit by missiles.
And he says that's the majority of cities. This is not true. In part because of American aid, a lot of cities have been able to avoid the worst of the destruction that the frontline cities in eastern Ukraine have. Russia's invasion to protect the quote-unquote Russian speakers from their propaganda outlets, at least that's what they said, has mostly concentrated the violence in eastern Ukrainian, Russian-speaking communities. So this is just another, like, this is a subtle lie compared to, like, the other lies, but it's just, in every moment when he talks about the war, you find little things like this little pieces of misinformation, little pieces of just lies here, lies there, and this person in 19 days could very well be the next president-elect, calling up Vladimir Putin, just like he has done at least 7 times before, according to Bob Woodward's new book, War, and then trying to organize the end of the war without Ukraine, which Viktor Orban just proposed recently after hearing Ukraine's victory plan, that the Europeans, like the Germans and the French, start negotiations with the Russians on a unilateral basis, like excluding Ukraine, just go negotiate with them because Ukraine's new plan is so crazy. So he's not the only leader that's in the wider sphere of what we'd call the West that is pushing in this direction either. Okay, I am back. You guys ready? I am ready. What happened? Sometimes, on occasions, I need to go use the bathroom. And that's what I had to do.